Hey there! Welcome to a very special episode of Hobie on YouTube. It's special because I have a very amazing vintage Swiss Army knife to share. Dave Arnold, the author of A Collector's Guide to Vintage Winger Knives, has allowed me to feature three very rare, beautiful, and interesting knives from his collection and featured in his book on my channel. Okay, so the third and final knife I have to share from Dave's collection and book is a vintage Victorinox. And this knife was originally part of Stefan Schober's collection. Now when Dave and I talked about what knives to include in this series, I suggested that we throw in at least one Victorinox, because I'm a big Victorinox fan, and I know a lot of you all are too. So Dave picked out for me an early officer's knife, but he knows that I have several of those myself and have featured some on the channel. So he sent me one that is very much different than one I have ever seen before. And we're really not quite sure about the origins of this knife or how it came to be like it is. So here it is. A 91mm Victorinox officer's knife with the original reddish-brown fiber scales. And we can talk about how to date this knife here in just a second. But first let's look at what makes it unique. First, you might notice that it has bird's eye rivets. These are rivets with little washers around them embedded into the scales to give the joints more strength. The problem is, Victorinox never used bird's eye rivets on regular production models. Now I do know that they used bird's eye rivets on some early prototypes because I found a picture on their website showing that. You might also notice that this is a 5-layer knife. Again, the problem is Victorinox at this point in time only made up to 4-layer knives. And as we go through the tools, you'll see some odd combinations there as well. I'd like to place this knife within the evolutionary timeline of Victorinox officers' knives. I think that will help us date the knife. And hey, who doesn't like to look at old Victorinoxes anyway? So in 1897, Karl Elsener, under the company name Elsener Swiss, introduced the officers and sports knife. And it originally had brown fiber scales, no shield, no bail, and had 4 visible pins. Then in 1902, a shield was made optional, as well as a bail. And some new tools were introduced, notably saw and scissors. Then in 1909, on the company's 25th year jubilee, the shield was made standard to celebrate that occasion and really to fend off some imitators, namely from Zolligen, Germany. And now you have 3 visible pins. Also in 1923, stainless steel was offered for the first time. And then finally in this little lineup that we have here today, in 1937 the brown fiber scales were dropped for red plastic celluloid scales. So where does this knife fit in? Well, obviously it does not have red plastic scales, so it's before 1937. But it does have 3 visible pins, so it's after 1909. And as we go through the tools, you'll see that it has stainless steel, so it's after 1923. So for now we can narrow its date range down to somewhere between 1923 and 1937. Let's look at the tools because that's where things continue to get interesting. And again, this is a 5-layer knife, which is notable because at the time, Victorinox's regular production only ran up through 4 layers. But here's the 3-sided European style awl on the back. It's very pointed. This knife does have nickel silver linings. They either had nickel silver or brass on these early models, and believe it or not, some of the very earliest had aluminum. And then here's a vintage 5-turn grooved corkscrew. Now we know that is vintage, but originally the Victorinox officer's knives were 5-turn solid corkscrews. This decorative groove, turns out, was added later and then much later down the road dropped. So we'll start here on the mark side and work our way to the back. And typically here in the front, you've got the opening tools layer. And so you do here, we've got the old style can opener with the vertical pull that drops down into the notch there. And then over here on the blade side, we have the old style screwdriver, flat, with a no cap lifter. So far so good. It's the next layer of tools where things start to get kind of weird. Behind the screwdriver is another screwdriver. And in this case, a more modern one with the cap lifter. So it's very unusual. As a matter of fact, Dave has actually talked to some representatives at Victorinox about this, and they have stated that they never did this on a regular production knife. They would never put an old style tool together with the new style tool. Now Victorinox states in some literature that I have that they introduced the cap lifter in 1942. But that's just wrong. And forgive me for being so bold as to say that Victorinox got that wrong in a couple pieces of literature, but they just did. I've seen way too many examples of earlier knives that have the cap lifter, including my own officer's knife from this same time frame. And I think the reason Victorinox has stated that is because the cap lifter first appears in the 1942 Elsener Swiss catalog. There's this big gap of information, written documentation between 1903, when we have a catalog, and 1942, when we have the next catalog. So I think what they were doing there is they just saw it first appear in the 1942 catalog, and they said 1942. But it appears on much earlier knives, and that only makes sense because Winger was actually using the cap lifter in their screwdriver in 1918. And it just doesn't make sense that Victorinox would wait all that time before they introduced the cap lifter. My guess is that the cap lifter actually got introduced about the same time that stainless steel was made available, and that would have been about 1923. But anyway, so very unusual to have the old style and the new style tools back to back in a knife. And I've also noticed that this screwdriver has a much narrower blade than a typical one. And that could be from, a chip or something being repaired, someone reprofiling the tool. You can see here that it is twisted at the tip. I don't know, that could be just a separate injury once that tip was narrowed. Or it could just be like a prototype tool. But here it is again, up against a regular one from the same time frame. And we can see that other than the width of that blade, they are pretty similar. And then across from that on the second layer is a blade that we never see on Victorinox officers' knives, a hawksbill blade. Now, we do see this on much later Alox models, and you can find it on earlier farmers and work knives, like this one. Now, this knife does not actually have that blade, but this is the style Victorinox knife that I'm talking about. I'll put an image of one of these with the hawksbill blade that I found in the 1903 catalog. So that layer is very much in question. That is the extra layer with a very strange addition of tools. And as we go through the rest of the knife, you'll see that it's much more standard. Here's the third layer, and it is the vintage scissors. The fourth layer is a wood saw. Again, this is the old style wood saw with a nail nick and a squared off butted tip here. And then the blades The early style clip point secondary or pen blade. Whoops. And the main blade. Now this blade has a couple of etches on it, but I do believe it has been polished and sharpened, and therefore some of these etches have been maybe weakened if they weren't already. But here I can read Weber, ER, and then underneath that ERN. I don't know if Weber was the full word, and obviously the one below it's been obscured. But over on this side we have a much clearer etching, A. Schumacher, which my guess is was the original owner's name, who he probably had his name etched into the knife blade. That was fairly common. These were very prized possessions at the time. These were very, as they are now, these were the finest pocket knives in the world. So the tang stamp that this old knife carries is Army Swiss in block letters with the Swiss cross to the left. And we can date that from 1935 to 1951. That was when that tang stamp was in use. But on the back we have Victorinox with a crossbow in the middle and then lines above and below. And that tang stamp was used from 1931 to 1942. So thinking out loud here, I guess with that Army Swiss tang stamp, 1935 to 1951, and the fact that these are not red plastic scales that started in 1937, we could probably narrow this knife's birth date down somewhere between 1935 and 1937. So what gives with this knife, with the mysterious features like the bird's eye rivets, the extra layer with the odd assortment of tools? Well, I think the easiest guess would be it's been modded, that it was an early modding expertly done that added that layer and those extra tools. But I'd like to propose another theory, and that's all it is just a theory or my opinion. But I'd like to think that this knife might be a prototype. Maybe something made by Victorinox, not for regular production, but just to show off, perhaps, a couple of new and upcoming tools. Here's why I think that that idea has some credence. Number one, I see absolutely no evidence of the pins, the scales, or the liners being molested in any way, as you would have to do to hammer out the pins and rebuild this knife. The whole thing fits together precisely as if it came from a factory. And then finally, notice how the nail nicks on these three tools, the first generation screwdriver here in the front, the second generation screwdriver with the cap lifter behind it, and the scissors behind them. Look how they all line up so well to be perfectly accessible. What modder can do that? I mean, what modder can pick and align tools on new springs and things to do that? I don't know. So when I saw that picture on Victorinox's website of the early knives with fiber scales with bird's eye rivets, that's when I thought, well, perhaps this is a prototype. I know that's a thought that both Stefan and Dave have entertained as well. Truth is, we'll never know. Prototype, maybe salesman's example, or just a very excellent modding attempt. It's a very mysterious, one-of-a-kind, vintage Victorinox. So this brings us to the end of our little Swiss Army knife collecting adventure, in which we've seen a very early Winger officer's knife, a premium model in black fiber scales with the first generation shield, and a gimlet tool. A very beautiful and elegant Winger Tahara gentleman's knife in mother of pearl scales with a mechanical Swiss timepiece. And finally, this early Victorinox officer's knife, fully loaded and with a lot of questions. I'd like to thank Dave Arnold one more time for lending me these precious pieces from his collection so that I could share those with you. If you like these kind of knives, you want to see more amazing vintage Swiss Army knives, I encourage you to go to Amazon and get a copy of his book. I've just been thrilled with the response to these videos so far. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thanks for your interest and your support. And as always, have fun collecting.